That's great, Matt. You know, the program that I run up in Boston called the Good Grief Program, we often talk about in the crisis of loss lies an opportunity for mastering coping skills. And you're looking at 3 poster children right here. Let's give them a hand for their honest... It's really... doesn't it feel special to sit here and listen to them unfold a story and to listen to their honesty? Now, I, of course, have some questions, but I bet you do too. But I actually have the mic, so I get to ask the questions first. So these are different kinds of loss. With David, with Jamie, it was around violence. You had to deal with a violent death. With Annabelle, it was an accident where you witnessed the accident. And Matt, with you, it really was a series of losses that probably started also with a divorce. So, and a divorce is a death, but what dies in a divorce? The family. The family dies because the people are still around, but the essence of what family is, sitting around the table having dinner or planning for a holiday or whatever, that's what that is really over. That's what has died. Judith Wallerstein, whom I call the diva of divorce, she is on the West Coast and has done some seminal research, does this longitudinal research that has looked at folks 5, 10, 20, 30 years after parents have divorced, where now adult children can say, oh, thank God they divorced. They would kill each other today if they were in the same room. Both of my parents are really happy being with other people or being in whatever life they have now. I totally, intellectually, I get it. But there is still this hope, this fantasy that there will be a reconnection as long as your parents are alive, that they'll meet at a wedding, at a bat mitzvah, at a funeral, and something will happen because it's the family that died. So I know that maybe we'll get a chance at some point to talk a little bit more about divorce, because it is certainly one more opportunity to develop and master coping skills. But for a minute, I'd like to focus a little bit on when you have a sudden death versus an anticipated death. And although you anticipated it, Matt, for just a very short amount of time, as you said, you were able to say goodbye. When there is a loss, as you, as Meredith and David have suffered, it's almost unmentionable what we had to sit through and tolerate while they told their story about what happened. Doesn't it make everyone feel just a little uncomfortable for them, thinking, how could this be? How can they actually give words to it? And yet what I have learned from people, like the 3 people on the stage, that if it's unmentionable, it's unmanageable. If you can't talk about it, then you can't begin to manage the feelings. And again, this is what we're getting to witness tonight. How difficult was it for you that had violence and also an accident that you had to witness? How difficult was it when you had to resume your life? If you can actually remember back after the funeral, after the memorial service, after the Banana Bread Brigade ended, and you were kind of left. How does an accident, how does violence shape grief? Anyone can, and Matt, you can jump in here too, because you've gotten a chance to be an armchair grief quarterback in terms of the work you've done as well. So how do you think it shapes it differently? Do you think there's a difference when it's sudden, when it's violent, when it's an accident?
I think the grief, when it's sudden, the grief begins at the moment it happens. If it's an anticipated death, the grief begins, I think, when you realize that your loved one's going to die. So the grief is there. It's just maybe more anticipated. And I'm not sure which is easier. Neither of them are. One of the images that I remember, for example, when we met the doctor at MCV, And I certainly hope this fellow is now selling used cars. He was a resident, or somebody got to him. But the resident, and he explained to us, we saw before we went in to see Jamie, he explained to us what Jamie's injury was in rather cold, calculating terms. And my wife, Jeannie, just burst into tears. And he looked at her and he said, "Can you get yourself under control so I can go on?" We were invited back to speak to some of the MCV residents later, and we cited that story. And they did the same thing. They went, "Can you believe?" That was one of the images of the emergency room. The other people at MCV were absolutely incredible. The ones in the unit, the nurses, the doctors, the chaplains. Bishop Peter James Lee of the Episcopal Diocese of Virginia came and spent most of the night with us. And one of the images that's etched in my brain forever is the Bishop of Virginia with tears in his eyes, anointing Jamie and commending him to God at Jamie's bedside. And that's emblazoned in I can't remember last Tuesday, but that going back 15 years. And then he took us into a side room and he said, "David, the people of the West End are very gracious." And he said, "You will be receiving congealed," I remember he used the word, congealed salads for about 5 months. We got congealed salads, beef tenders, bottle of Chivas Regal one day. But the initial numbness that overcame us, I walked around like a zombie. I have heard of parents, fathers speaking at their son's or daughter's funeral. There was no way I could have done that. Our son at that point, our oldest son at that point, was a stronger one. He was able to drive me around. There were people I had to see to get some legal things done and whatever, and he was sort of upholding his father. But the day after it all happened, and David and Heather were in the guest room next to us, and to our bedroom, and on the TV came the picture of the Friendlies out on Patterson Avenue with the yellow police line around it, and there was one car in the parking lot, and it was Jamie's 95 Dodge Stratus. And suddenly, I was in the hallway, I guess, and suddenly I heard my wife just wailing, "They've killed my baby, they've killed my baby, they've killed my baby." And David and Heather were in the next room, and David told me later that it was the most terrifying moment that he could remember, because his parents were always in control. We could always fix things. We could always make things better. We could kiss it better if they were injured. And he heard his mother wailing, "They've killed my baby." She was hysterical. Then our daughter-in-law, who became the sort of the family travel manager, she fended off the news media, or kind of sorted out the news media. Some of the news media was incredibly sensitive. The local television stations were really very sensitive. But there were images that lingered. The senior warden of St. Stephen's, that's sort of the head layman in the church, came to get us at our house that Sunday because our family was going to go to church and sit in the side pew in the side chapel. And I said to Harry Easterly, Harry, when he first came over the second day, I said, "Harry, I really want to meet these young men who killed Jamie. I feel badly for them." And he was so impressed that I was so forgiving and whatever. And the next day he came over. I said, "Harry, I need to amend what I told you yesterday. I do want to meet those two men, and I want to kill them." And I remember going. We had 2.5 years of court appearances, very hard, and to see defense lawyers doing their job. They were both convicted. One got life plus 55. The other was given a lighter sentence because he testified against the other, did a plea bargain. So the judge gave him a lighter sentence. He gave him life plus 50. Judge kept his word. But the anger and the rage that was very much present with me. I mean, I just felt a sense of rage. And people who are angry aren't that much fun to be around. There was My colleague wrote a letter to the Times-Dispatch about the need for more common sense gun safety legislation. We live in the most violent country on the planet, my colleague wrote a letter to the Times-Dispatch, and a parishioner came into my office a few days later, and he said, "David, you know, there's another side to the gun issue." I looked at him, I said, "Excuse me?" He said, "There's another side to the gun issue." And that letter that Tom wrote, he said, "I disagree with it." And I could just feel it rising up. And they say in geometry, the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. And to go around my desk would have taken longer. And I'm told I look back at it now and laugh. I was on top of my desk as this guy was beginning to think he maybe had said something that I didn't like. And he was a large man, and he was backing out of my office. He took a lamp and a chair with him as he was backing out. But I had such rage. And, of course, that whole issue, still, I've wrestled with that one. But those are some of the images that I had in the beginning of just being very difficult to control.
Sure. And I think especially with violence, that's a flavor that we get to experience. We're rageful. And as you say, the culture doesn't support that so much. And probably your wife wasn't too crazy about it either. And she, you know, I think you brought up so many things that we could talk about, one of which is you had grown-up children. You had a little 16-month-old. You had nobody at the time to take care of. So that dynamic of your family really did matter in terms of so often families will say, well, I have to get up because I've got a baby to take care of. I'd like to stay in bed too, but actually I've got a 16-month-old. And so how does the dynamic of a family change that journey? How does the suddenness or the violence or an accidents are preventable, but only in hindsight, of course. Did you have something you could say, Meredith, about the accident?
When it's something that sudden that, I mean, you're just minding your own business, having a good time with your little ones, having a play date in the morning, and then you come home with just a box that they gave me to put, like, memoirs in, like, that made a hat box and put pretty paper on it and stuff. You come home with that instead of your child. And my house felt like a different place. We were, of course, numb. And it's this feeling where you feel like, my husband used to always say it made him feel like he was drunk, but not in a good way at all. It was just like a numbing. You don't feel like you're inside living in your own body. You feel like you've stepped out of it and you're kind of a zombie. But, you know, just I remember going home and everything seemed so quiet. And it just changed everything so much with our family. Annabelle's little brother, they were only 14 months apart. And he did everything with her because they were so close in age. And he didn't even know how to play by himself. And I remember for 2 weeks, because I kept looking at the calendar saying, when is he going to improve? He just walked around and kind of moaned, like he wasn't interested in interacting with a toy or a friend or anything unless you tried to sit down and really play with him. And then the first day he picked up a car and started playing with it by himself. You know, we knew that he would pull through, and of course he doesn't remember anything. And I kept asking the pediatrician, are you sure he's not going to remember? Because he was standing right there too. So with an accident, it's just so hard to grasp and
And that's
absorb.
a very good point. We talk about the task of understanding and the task of grieving. When it's anticipated, you have some time to understand what happened. You got to see that tumor. You got to hear a prognosis. And so the task of understanding started right there at the doctor's. For each of you who had a sudden loss, the grief is the same. I mean, you grieve, but the understanding piece is so much harder because you had no time to really have this unfold. Matt?
Time is an interesting thing there because, like, I don't remember anything. Like I always say, when the circus leaves town, I like your banana bread brigade. It's good because everyone's ready to help you through that grieving for about a month. But you haven't even, you don't even know what day it is yet until about 6 weeks. And so society's ready for you to be over it way before you're even ready to start grieving. I actually took off, man. I mean, I had a friend call me, and she's like, how you doing? Because my whole family, died. So I was kind of by myself in my dad's big house in Churchill. And I remember my friend called from Hawaii, and she's like, well, how you doing? I was like, man, I'm just getting through this. She goes, well, why don't you just get through this in Hawaii? And I was like, that's a good idea. And I took off. I ran. And when I was ready to start dealing with it, society had really moved on because my dad died right before 9/11. And then 9/11 hit, and it was like, well, forget everybody else because this is much bigger. And I know
that's very interesting.
You don't want to compare. I mean, we talked about earlier, it's not a race of whose loss is bigger. But I was just coming to terms with my dad dying when the rest of the world was worried about 9/11. So I was alone for a long time, and I didn't realize that until ironically, there was a kid at Comfort Zone. I'll say his name because we talk all the time still. His name is David. His dad was a cop that died on the morning of 9/11 of cancer, and he didn't die in the towers. And to hear that kid talk about getting made fun of by the other cops' sons that died in the towers and his son didn't. And so when you start to hear these really young kids talk about the grief specific to the same time I was thinking about it, it really, that's when I started to really, really deal with it. But I mean, I don't know. I don't have an answer for that, but it's really hard when timing doesn't add up because you're just not ready to deal with it yet.
Sure. There's some nice data that says it's about the fourth month where the level of support just falls off a cliff. So if you've been getting a call from your mother-in-law every day or once a week or whatever, and the clergy calls you and neighbors call you and so on, so it's about the beginning of the fourth month when you're pretty much on your own. And for many, many individuals, depending on the loss, they haven't even thought of. They haven't been able to start.
Business mode. You just want to get the estate settled, and you want to get everything done, and you're in such business mode that you really delay any grief. I mean, that's a good number.
Well, and you didn't have a 14-month-old that you had to get up for, a 16-month-old, and you had a criminal trial that you knew that was going to just unfold over years, I'm sure. And so that kind of just pushes everything off, too, and you just know that there's no way you're going to tidy this one up. Not that you could anyway. What you started to talk about, Matt, I certainly named as competitive grief. Whose grief is worse? And so the question you asked, you said, I wonder what's harder, the sudden death or the one that's anticipated. That's a trick question I like to ask residents whom I teach at BU School of Medicine. And we need to keep teaching residents, by the way. But it's a trick question because which grief is harder when you get that dreaded call in the middle of the night or there's an accident or you have 2 years to say goodbye to a spouse? And the answer is, of course, the grief that you are experiencing is the harder one, whatever you're facing, because grief is so isolating and it is self-centered. It is your idiosyncratic pain. You wanted to say?
When you say that grief is isolating, I had always heard that couples grieve differently, and I've often said when I counsel people in my work, remember things affect you differently and allow for that. And then I discovered that Jeannie was not helped by some of the things that I was helped by. She was grieving differently, and something very terrifying was happening between us because we'd have these piles of mail come every day, and I'd want to sit in our family room and read them. And one night I said, honey, come and read these with me. And she said, I'll be there in a minute. And I asked her again, I said, where are you? She said, I'm out here. And finally went out in the kitchen. The kitchen was dark. She was looking out the window, and she looked at me, and she said, both in anguish and even anger to me, she said, I cannot bear to be with you to read those things. I have to read them myself. And I thought that we were falling apart. And finally it was our counselor, Dr. Vic Malloy, who helped us realize that that couples grieve differently. the same loss affects each one of us differently. They say that, I think either, I've heard two statistics, 1 out of 8 or 1 out of 10. 1 out of 10 marriages survives the death or chronic illness of a child. And I can see how, and if we had not had a strong foundation, and if we had not gotten into professional counseling within 2 weeks, I can see how marriages can dissolve. And I remember going to see, it was Dr. Ted Peck, and it was within the first couple of weeks, and he said to us, he sat us down in his office, and he said, David and Jeannie, I want to tell you something. He said, it's terrible for you right now. He said, 6 months from now, it's going to be a whole lot worse. And I thought, well, that's interesting. It couldn't be any worse than it is now, so keep tell me more. He said, a year from now, it's going to be worse. I said, well, that's interesting. It's so bad now, I can't imagine. Tell me more. He said, well, 2 years from now, he said, it could be even worse because the numbness will have worn off and you will have all your friends will have expected that you're healing and that you will be back to normal again. And just as you are getting worse and worse, are feeling it harder and harder, he said it may take up to 3 years before you begin to even make any kind of a turn. And it didn't bother me at all because it couldn't hurt any worse than it did right then. 6 months later, I said to Ted, I am so grateful that you told me because it is so much worse. And again, a year. There was another dear friend of ours, Joni and Doug Burgoyne. Their daughter was murdered at JMU 8 years before Jamie. And Doug and Jeannie and I have known each other for many years. And Doug was the first one at our house after the hospital. And then Joni came over the next day. And she made Jeannie and me a cup of tea and sat at our table. She put her hand on each one of our arms. And she said, this won't mean anything to you right now because your grief is so raw. Their daughter was murdered by a transient he ended up going through the border and escaping. She said, your grief is so raw that this won't make any sense to you right now. But she said, in time, it will become more manageable. She never said, in time, you'll feel better. She said, in time, it will become more manageable. And I've always been so grateful to Joni for telling us that because it is more manageable.
I think that we can agree that when someone can give us some anticipatory guidance, whether it's about our 2-year-old or about this unique situation we're going through, it can be helpful. Whether we listen, whether we can do what is being offered is another question. But it's nice sometimes to have some ideas to what the journey is like. I think when I interviewed you, I don't remember, but when I see a family that has lost a child, I am very cognizant of not saying that this is the worst grief, but it is in a different category of losing a spouse or a sibling. We call it complicated mourning, and you will spend a lifetime accommodating it. And I love that word, accommodating it. That is, it's like you start with a boulder in your shoe. That would really hurt. And at some point, if you're lucky, as the grief becomes less raw, the edges of it are less raw, the boulder actually smooths out too. And it may feel like a rock or a stone or actually a grain of sand at some place if you're fortunate, you do your work and all the stars line up. But it's always there, so you always limp. But for another person who's lost a child to be able to say, there will be a chance for you to feel joy again in your life. I think that is really good news for people who can't even imagine how that could ever happen. And I think that's very important. How about for you? How was your, if you'd like to share about, how did you and your husband do it similarly or different?
Initially, it was a little more similar. Then down the road, we became different because he stopped feeling a need to go, and I kept going to therapy. And with Annabelle's Angels, it allowed me to be in scenarios where I was in front of people I didn't know and telling them my story. And so that was a whole different, because he was like not wanting to do that. Like he was just like, you go and do that and I'm fine with that, but I'm going to go to work and you can tell me how well it went. And, but at first we did seem to be kind of similar, and then it changed.
Did you find a way? I certainly hope that you each were able to find a way to be respectful of your differences. And it's the one time that I feel strongly that a couple needs to seek professional help. Other than that, I really don't have an opinion about it. I think that it's as idiosyncratic as people are. But when you've lost a child, I think that is very helpful, if for no other reason, to say that your paths may be very different and you have to actually be respectful of those different paths. And if not, then instead of paralleling, you end up often feeling very distanced at some point, and no one wants that to happen. So, and part of it, and this is a bias, and it's only anecdotal, but I think that often for the husband and the father, there's this sense of my job is not only is your job as parents to protect your children, and there's the fantasy that you can always do that and so on, but there's this sense from the father or the husband that it's his job to protect his family and make it okay for his wife and other children. And of course you can't do that. And so I always think that your shoulders have to be even a little bit broader as the dad. And so therefore, let me find a way to fix it. And how can I fix it? So I often will hear from families that I counsel that the dad has, there's a scholarship and they're doing a golf tournament, but we're building an entire playground. And the dad is in charge of building the playground, and he's involved. And you can just imagine it. I want to construct something. I want to see something. I need to use my energy in a way that is positive. I need us to move on, because I cannot imagine that I've lost not just my child, but my wife as well. And so it puts an enormous burden on the whole family as a dynamic. When someone can explain that, it just is a little helpful to say, that's why I feel this way. I'm not certain that it modifies it. And how about for you, Matt, as you're listening and you didn't have a family that you needed to get up and take care of, and you could kind of exit to Hawaii, what was helpful for you?
Sorry, I got a cough drop. For me, there was brutal honesty from a friend. Two parts of that question. For me, I didn't want to just maintain or manage the pain. I wanted to heal. I was really clear enough at that point that I didn't want my life to end forever. And I was 24, so my views on life were pretty simplistic. But I was stuck. I was lost. I had nothing, and I felt like nothing. And I was just like, I don't want to be this way. I want to live again. And so I was really determined for that. I know later, for me, not to push so much on comfort zone, but to have the friends of the other healing circle, big buddies and leaders and all that. I mean, to have that big group of 30, 40 people that have gone through very similar things. I mean, I don't know where I'd be in life if I didn't have that. I had, 4 years straight of that. So that was huge. But for me, the kicker was I was alone. And then a good friend, former girlfriend, she wouldn't let me be alone anymore, and she pushed her way into my life. And
how lucky were you?
Yeah, very lucky. And then she got brutally honest, and I was also having very negative life decisions at the time. And she was like, I understand you're grieving. She's like, but you're an asshole that's grieving. And she's like, you got to get past the being a jerk part. And sorry to cuss, but that's to get the point across. She really hammered that through to me. So I did have a family. It was that girl that really made me realize, okay, I can grieve, but I can't let my life fall apart. And she really pushed me into being a better person.
I'm so glad she did that, and I'm so glad that you could hear it, because
it's pretty hard not to hear.
A lot of people say Chivas Regal is actually not your friend, but you kind of still see it as your friend because it does dull the pain. And so I'm wondering, I would want to ask the question, spirituality, religious belief systems, it's not something you can just acquire in the moment when you need it. You need to have it in advance. The data is pretty clear. The possibility of doing counseling, medication, doing nothing, it's totally inconclusive. I mean, it's like shooting myself in the foot, but it's really the truth. All the work I do, it doesn't necessarily promote healing. The one factor that actually does suggest an outcome that is positive is for when people are religious, when people have a religious belief. And again, you just can't buy it when you need it. So with that said, and of course this is like throwing a softball to Reverend here. How did that affect each of you, either your religious beliefs or lack of? Meredith, do you want to start?
Sure. We weren't regular at a church or anything. My husband grew up in a very strong Christian home, and like his mom sang in the choir, his dad played the organ. They went on Wednesday and twice on Sunday, and I didn't know a whole lot about the stuff that he knew a whole lot about. So we were kind of different, but we hadn't gotten into that groove as a family. So we did end up going to a counselor that was at the church where Annabelle we had her service. It's right next to my house, and we did speak to the counselor there, and we just found that everything we asked her, of course she could speculate, but she didn't know for sure, and nobody knows for sure, but we would definitely get angry and ask why, and we tried to think of things that maybe we had done and we were being punished because that's just how we felt. We felt like, what did we do wrong? Why is this happening? Why is this happening to us? And, and especially for a child. And people would tell me, I think that God has a plan and everything happens for a reason. And I would get angry and say, there is no reason good enough for me to have to stand there and see what I saw. I'm sorry. There's just not. I mean, maybe there's this higher power that thinks there is, but I cannot agree with that because it's my baby. And I don't think any parent should have to lose a child, much less have such an awful death. So I think, people say maybe he allowed it for a specific reason, or I'm like, that is the work of the opposite. The devil did that because, how else does something that awful happen? So you throw your arms up and you're like, I don't know.
So God needed a baby in heaven didn't really work for you. Yeah, that's right. Right, exactly. And yet, the intentions are always good, right? When people say this, it's because they are saying, how can I offer something? What can I possibly say to help Meredith? And so we hear ourselves saying these crazy things. And even if we think we believe them, there's no reason to think that she's going to believe them. And then we look at her face and we know that was not really the right thing to say.
I think, Meredith, you really touched on it, and I think anyone who's lost a loved one, particularly lost a child, hears this time and time again. People would say, God needed Jamie up in heaven. And some lady called me on the phone in my office and asked me that, and that's when I had to learn. They finally put me on vitamin P. Does anybody know what that is?
She said Prozac for any of you that didn't hear.
And that, putting me on vitamin P probably saved a number of people's lives. A young woman called me one day and she said, I am so sorry about Jamie, but she said, I just want you to know that God needed him and that's why he took him to heaven. And I said, are you sitting down? And before I finally got her into tears, which was not my intention, but I said, if God used a handgun to take my son because he needed him, he's a selfish God with whom I would not want to have anything to do with. God does, I am convinced beyond, there are a lot of things in the Christian faith I still take on faith. This I know for sure. God does not take our loved ones because God needs them up in heaven. God has plenty of time to take them at a ripe old age, or to relieve them when their bodies wear out. But Annabelle, was not.
Well, I just don't think that he would give her to us just to take her away 2.5 years later.
Yeah,
I mean, it's kind of, that's such a double-sided, or whatever analogy you can use, but you're supposed to believe one thing, and then someone's telling you the opposite later, and I'm like, well, then why would we have been given her in the first place?
We try to make sense out of something of which there's no way to make sense. The only thing that I do believe is that God was there when Annabelle died to take Annabelle into safety, and to take Jamie. That was there to receive them, but that was not God's will.
Matt, how about you?
Well, I listen, I hear these, and I think the key is for the guys in the audience. I mean, like, it is okay to question your faith in this process. I think it's encouraged, and I think that's the message, is that people are, I mean, I had a little kid at Comfort Zone one time that a 6-year-old, and his brother had committed suicide, and he was drawing pictures of, or 7-year-old, he was drawing pictures of his brother, and it was a picture of this guy with a boom box and these 2 big gates. And I was like, well, what's the picture? He's like, that's my brother that listened to music with Jesus in heaven. And he's like, do you think my brother's in heaven? I was like, well, what do you think? He goes, and just turned back in. It was classic training, and he goes,
good for you.
He goes, yeah, of course he is. And he goes, I don't know. Yeah, he is. And I was like, okay, cool. But I think for me, I just regardless of the age of the person that's grieving, it is normal to question your faith. Sure. And I think you will naturally find your own way.
That's great. While we are talking about phrases and ways that people want to be helpful, let's do Letterman's 10 most ridiculous things that people have said to you that you wish they hadn't, but it's out of the bag once it's there. So let's do 10 or fewer. Who wants to start? Just yell them out.
Now I'm drawing a blank.
That
must have taken you a long time to get over.
Okay, that's one.
My dad did drink a lot, and his one of his buddies goes, I can't believe his liver didn't die before the cancer got him.
Thank you.
It's like,
very
wow,
much.
yeah, that's a funny one,
That's
dude.
great. Right, exactly. David, how about you?
Someone said it's for the best. He's out of danger. It's all part of God's plan because God needed it. We've covered that one. That people would say, just be thankful you have 3 other sons.
Right. At least you have
At least
your
you
son,
have the other sons.
You have baby Drew, and at least you have him. And I'm like, or are you going to try to have another one? Mm-hmm. Or someone has asked me on more than one occasion details about the accident itself. And you're like, do you really want to, that's called a trigger. Do you really want me to relive it right here for you? To give you the most awful, well, was there any sound? Did she scream?
Yeah.
And you're like, are you kidding me?
Yeah. I think at the very top of the pyramid, unless any of you has any more, no? Is I always like a drum roll for I know just how you feel.
Just how you feel.
Yeah, I think that's probably if
My
there's...
turtle died, you're right.
What? Yeah. My turtle died, and I remember feeling some of the same feelings. Right, exactly. So these are opportunities in community to begin to say, so when you are ready, just be quiet. And of course, the 2 words that always work is, I'm sorry. And
there was one more that lady said, Steel Magnolia came up to me after the trial, and she said, well, David, she said, at least now the trials are over, and you can have closure. And I said, let me tell you what closure is. Closure is something you go down to Home Depot or to Lowe's, and you get them, and then what they do is you put them on the door frame and on the door, and that helps your door close. I said, when we got home from court, and I looked at Jamie, the men had been sentenced, And I looked at Jamie. He is just as dead now as he was before the court came down. And I said, I really, frankly, do not know what you mean about closure. She later said, it's time David gets on with his life. Some people understand, some people don't. But the word closure, there were several weeks after 9/11, Jeannie and I were in a hotel on a Sunday morning, had the weekend off, and we were in this hotel, and we were about to go down to breakfast. And there came a thing on the news, and it said there was going to be a show, or there's going to be a service at Ground Zero. It was a grief counselor telling about this service at Ground Zero to bring closure to the families. So I started to go off, and I said, Jeannie, look at that. I was pointing at the TV. I said, this grief counselor is talking about closure at Ground Zero. It's been 4 weeks, or whatever it was. She's crazy. And Jeannie said, honey, here's your, I was in my shorts. She said, here's your T-shirt. Put your T-shirt on. The lady's in the television. She can't hear you, dear. So I said, but did you hear what she's saying? She's talking about closure. So Jeannie hands me my shirt and my pants. And finally, she gets me dressed, and we close the door, turn off the TV, and we were going down the hall. I was still pointing back to the door. I said, do you believe what that woman was saying? She said, dear, let's just go get breakfast. The whole idea of closure is we never receive closure.
And I don't want closure. I don't want to forget my dad. I talk about him every day. I have an hour-long podcast. Every week I talk about my dad for half an hour. My dad's not dead. I mean, he's gone, but I get people randomly come up to me now. Say, oh, man, I love those stories about your dad. That's the coolest thing in the world.
Yes.
I love it. I don't ever want closure.
When people ask you about your dad, that's
I beat him up. I love it. It's awesome. Because the good lives on. The bad's dead, but the good stuff is still around, and that's awesome.
It's terrific. I think the word has really become, I don't know how to say it, but since 9/11, there was so much talk about closure. I know Larry King asked me about, what about all the lack of closure? With the two of the planes, of course, emanated from Boston, and my program was really positioned to be able to be very effective from the very beginning to help dozens and dozens of loved ones from where the two planes that emanated from Boston. And so I did a lot of the talk shows, and I remember Larry asking me about closure. And, I think that psychologically it's a specific term that talks about the task of understanding. How do you understand what happened? And sometimes there is, when a child has to understand that Daddy got on a plane at Logan Airport and then it hit the building and there's nothing there that I have so I have to create a narrative, and I do my work to create a narrative. And so is it easier if I can look in a casket and see Grandpa or Uncle Henry? Sure, there's this opportunity to understand what dead looks like. And so that's really where the term comes from.
In that sense, it makes sense.
What?
In that sense, it does make sense.
Yeah, so that's where the term comes from. But everyone was so wanting closure because the culture has such a hard time tolerating pain. Yes? Now, I feel as though I'm preaching to the choir looking at this audience, so there's no need to. But you find that people just glaze over after a period of time because nobody wants you sad. It's actually easier unless you're rageful. And people are worried that someone's going to jump over the desk and hit them. Anger kind of happens like this. You're not angry, you get angry, and then you stop being angry. Or sadness. And so it's very hard to tolerate sadness. And so our culture has a distinctive way of saying, you just really need to, 3 words, get over it. GOI. Get over it. And of course, so this is where community can hold you when there are groups, when there are clergy, when there's your Aunt Frances or whoever kind of creates a place for holding you and she understands whatever the nature of this level of support is. That can be very, very helpful.